Does your wrist hurt every time you try to do plank or push-up? But in your day-to-day life, everything else seems to be fine, and it's only when you put pressure on your wrist that hurts? Well, today in this video, I'm going to share with you why your wrist is having pain while you're doing plank or pushed-up and what you can do about it. Let's go! Hi, I'm Melanie the Physio, also the co-founder of Capital Physiotherapy here in Australia. Wrist pain while doing plank and push-up can be caused by two issues and two very simplified categories. And the first category is what we call the structural category, and the other category is what we call a functional category. So a structural category that means that your wrist joint itself is having issues. So it's either your wrist joint itself have some injury, either whether it's degenerative changes or you actually injured your joint itself, or there's ligamentous injury in the joint itself, or there might be a cyst growing in your wrist joint. Now, today in this video, we are not talking about these structural issues. If you do have structural issues in your wrist that's causing pain while you're doing plank and push-up, you need to seek professional help right now. Today in this video, we are talking about all the functional issues that's leading you to have pain on your wrist while you're doing plank and push-up. Now, functional limitation is things like your muscle tightness, muscle weakness, or even just your form of doing plank and push-up is a little bit incorrect. That's what's leading to your wrist pain. So for the first step of tackling functional issue is you need to check whether your wrist even have that range to do push-up first. You need to put your hands forward and push your wrist all the way back without having your body weight, and see how far your wrist can actually move backwards.
Okay, so this is future Melanie. While she's doing editing, I realized that I only mentioned that your wrist need to have enough range, but I didn't actually say how much range you actually need. So if you test your wrist, and if your wrist is not more than 70 to 90 degree range, you need to do the stretches. Because if you can't do at least a 70 to 90 degree range on your wrist, you cannot do plank or push-up in a correct form.
So then you need to do some stretches on your muscles to help improve the range on your wrist first. Now, the exercise that can help with your wrist range to do push-up is wrist flexor stretch. So you want to put your elbow out in front of you and then keep your finger nice and long, and then push your wrist down towards the floor, and you should feel a stretch all the way on your forearm. Hold that there for about 30 seconds, and then after 30 seconds, see if you can push it even further and hold it for yet another 30 seconds. Repeat this process for about 2 to 3 repetitions throughout the day as often as you can. Now, the next issue with a functional issue is that your form while you're doing push-up is incorrect. Now, the first very common beginner mistake for plank and push-up is your hand position. Now, during a plank, your wrist should be positioned directly underneath your shoulder. If your wrist is too far out or too far forward, it puts more pressure on different parts of your wrist, which then can in turn increase the pressure that you put on the wrist, and that leading to your wrist pain while you're doing this exercise. The next beginner mistake is that you are not putting your hands flat on the floor. Now, if your palm is cupped up, you are putting more pressure on your wrist, and that will then in turn lead to wrist pain. You have to distribute your weight flat onto the floor, evenly distributing the weight throughout your finger and your wrist, making sure that everything is facing forward and as neutral as possible. Keeping your palm flat and not cupped, you're simply distributing your weight away from your wrist, which would then put pressure on other parts of your body more evenly. Now that's for plank position. Everything should be directly underneath your shoulder. Now for push-up though, we want our wrist position to be just slightly wider than shoulder width, not too far out again and not too far in, because either of those will cause too much pressure on your wrist. So if you're doing push-up and your hand is way too far out, as you can see, you're gonna put more pressure on one side of your wrist than the other. Whereas if you're doing push-up and your wrist is directly under your shoulder. Now we're not talking about a tricep push-up. When you do a tricep push-up, this position is fine. But if you're doing a normal push-up where you're slightly extending your elbows to 45 degrees, if your wrist is directly under your shoulder, when you bend your elbow to 45 degrees, as you can see, again, your wrist would be in a slightly tilted position. So you're not in a neutral position for your wrist. Whereas, if you're doing push-up, like the normal chest push-up, if your hand is slightly wider than shoulder width apart, when you engage everything and when you do a proper push-up, as you can see, now your wrist will be in a more neutral position. So making sure that your hand's placement is correct and making sure that your hands is flat on the floor is important to help distribute the weight evenly throughout your body and not load up on your wrist, which then can prevent your wrist pain. Another beginner mistakes that a lot of people do while they're doing push-up is flaring their elbow outwards too much. So, as much as you can, try to avoid flaring your elbow out too far away from your body. Now, in the beginning, this might make it easier to actually do a push-up, but if you adopt this posture for a long time, you're gonna start having a lot of wrist injury and shoulder injuries. When you're doing push-up, your elbow should be bent backwards and close against your side, about 45-degree angle. Practice the correct technique of pushing off from a wall or on a kneeling position first to get a feel of how your elbow and your wrist should be feeling while you're doing the push-up correctly. And when you've practiced that enough, then try to move your position to a full push-up and see whether that still hurts your wrist. Now, if you've tried to increase your wrist range and if you've tried to correct your form and still when you do pushed up, you are still having pain on your wrist, then the next thing you need to check is, do you even have the correct strength to do push-up to begin with? Now, push-up is not just an upper body exercise. Now, if you're doing your push-up with just purely your upper body strength without your core, your hip, and your shoulder strength, then you're putting a lot of pressure on the wrist, which then can lead to the pain that you're experiencing. It's very easy to spot if someone is doing the push-up correctly, because if you're not engaging your core and your hip correctly, when you're doing push-up, you are not moving your whole body as one movement. You will see that your back would either sway, either arching too much, or your hip will sticking out too much, or different parts of your body will move at different time of the push-up. And that is a first sign of telling you that some part of your body is not strong enough to be able to do a perfect form of push-up. If you're noticing that your back is swaying or your back is arching while you're going into a push-up, or if your hip is sticking out too much while you're doing push-up, that is the sign that you have core and hip weakness. So you need to build up your core and hip strength first before you can do a push-up properly. And the best way for doing push-up properly is to do plank first. And if your wrist had tried to come onto elbow plank first, practice plank perfectly first for at least a good 1 to 2 minutes. If you can hold the plank for 1 to 2 minutes perfectly in a nice straight line without sagging your back or sticking your hip out, then you should have enough strength to then start doing a push-up properly. And then the next strength area that you need to look at, and that implies to both plank and push-up, is whether your shoulder is engaging properly while you're doing these positions or these exercises. Now, if you look at the mirror and you see that your shoulder is sagging downwards, And while you're doing push-up or throughout doing push-up, or you can see that your shoulder blade is sticking out while you're doing push-up or while you're holding your plank, and as you get fatigued that the shoulder blade keeps sticking out more and more, that is the sign that you do not have enough shoulder strength to be doing these exercises yet. And because your shoulder is not taking the load of your body, it transferred down to your wrist, causing your wrist to be having to endure most of the load, and that leads to your wrist pain while you're doing this position. Now, if you realize that you do indeed need a little bit more core, hip, and shoulder strengthening before you can do a pushed up form properly, then we do have playlists that's delegated for all these different area of body parts. So I highly recommend you check them out. Even though the title might not suit you, I still highly recommend you check them out, because I'm sure there will be video and exercises in those videos that's going to help you strengthen all these areas. While you're trying to improve your wrist range and all the strength in your other parts of your body so that you can do a push-up properly, why not try doing a modified version of push-up first? So the first modification that you can do is an elevated push-up. So place your hand on a box or a bench or a step, anything that's slightly higher than the floor, so then the body is in a slightly 45-degree angle. This will then reduce the amount of range your wrist needs to do compared to when they're on the floor. Now step your leg out so that your body is at a straight angle. Keep your body and leg long in a nice straight line, and then lower yourself closer to the bench, making sure that your chest is in line with your wrist as you're bending your elbow, and then slowly push them back out again. While you're doing this, try not to sag your lower back or stick your hip out, and making sure that your whole body move in one synchronized movement and then come back up again. Start practicing these first, and that would eventually lead you to have stronger core, hip, shoulder strength as well, to then be able to do a push-up on the floor properly. Now the next modification that you can do is a closed fist pushed up. So if your wrist hurt and you're not able to bend them backwards, then try doing it in a fist position. Again, making sure that your wrist is nice and straight and they're not tilting one side more than the other. And try to do a push-up in this position instead. Same thing, you're gonna have to make sure that you engage everything, your hip, your core, your shoulder, so that everything as you bend down and come back up, move in one straight line. See if that would then help reduce your wrist pain while you're doing your push-up or your planks. However, this can be a good quick modification to stop your wrist pain while you're doing push-up, but fundamentally, if you are experiencing pain on your wrist in those positions, you should look into what's causing the root of these problems and fix them once and for all. Now, the next way you can modify a push-up is to do a wall push-up instead. Standing diagonally against the wall, put your shoulders slightly wider than shoulder width apart, engage your core, squeeze your hip together, make sure that your whole body is moving as one. Then, what you want to do is slowly bend your elbow back so that you're moving towards the wall, and making sure that your shoulder is nice and close to you in a 45-degree angle and they're not flaring out too much. Practice the correct technique by pushing off from the wall while standing. This way you will have a better understanding on how it should feel on your elbow and your wrist while you're bending them correctly. Once the wall push-up starts to get easy, you then can progress to pushing up from your knees instead. So coming into a 4-point kneeling while you're doing push-up. Now coming into a kneeling position or a crawling position where your hip and your knees are in line, and your shoulder again is slightly wider than shoulder width apart. Now a lot of people do this exercise wrong by just bending their elbow and not the rest of their body, and that is the incorrect way of doing push-up. You need to make sure that you're pushing your hip forward and engage your core and your hips so that they're moving in one nice diagonal line, and then you're gonna lean yourself forward to try to aim for your chest line to be in line with your wrist. That is the correct way of doing push-up. And as you engage everything, you then bend your elbow, making sure that your shoulder is nice and controlled and your forearm and your arms itself is in a nice and controlled way, lowering yourself without flaring out the elbow too much, and then slowly extending yourself back up again. Try repeating this for a few repetitions until you start getting fatigued or until your form starts to go off, and then stop. Repeat these a couple of sets, from 2 to 3 sets, and practice it every day before trying a full push-up. I hope you find this video helpful to help you get to a better form and reduce your wrist pain while you're doing plank and push-up. I upload video here on a weekly basis on health and fitness related topic as well as injury rehab topic. Once again, I'm Melanie and I will see you in the next video. Until then, stay safe, happy and healthy. Good luck with your plank and push-up. See ya!